The notification came at 10:14 a.m., buzzing against the stainless steel table where I was checking a vial label. The cleanroom lights made the phone look like a tiny clinical heart monitor. One line: "He's gone." You learn very quickly in regulated manufacturing how to carry two realities at once. There is the absolute, private rupture. The person you loved is suddenly gone. And there is the ongoing choreography of containment suits, gowning protocols, and batch timelines that will not pause because your world has stopped. I folded the phone into my gloved hand, finished the visual inspection, and walked out of the cleanroom like someone postponing grief until after a shift change. By the time I reached the parking lot, my VP was already on the phone. Chad Kensington liked punctuality. He liked the feel of authority more than the responsibilities that came with it. "Holly, we need you on site," he said. His voice did not crack. "This is a production week. Can you be at the plant by noon?" I told him my father had died. I told him I needed time off. The FMLA request was procedural: a click in our HR portal, a form, a conversation with Kayla. But in that system, forms are how reality is defined. "You can take a day," Chad said. "But remember, we have a QP shift rotation and the license. You understand how critical coverage is. Can you confirm who will stand in for you?" "There's Marcus," I said. "He's the shift supervisor. He knows the release criteria." "Fine," Chad replied, with an economy of concern that read like a calculation. "Take care of things at home. We'll handle the plant." He called me 2 hours after the funeral service. He stood at the edge of the cemetery, a precise man in a Patagonia vest, offering condolence with the calibrated distance of someone who never had to hold the hand of a dying parent. Then he delivered the thing I should have expected from a man who mistook cruelty for decisiveness. "Holly," he said, "we're going to have to let you go." He said it like a transaction. He said it like a cleanup. We were at the graveside, sunlight falling through maples. People were murmuring. My uncle had his arm around me. Chad produced an envelope, thick with the soft purr of HR stationery, and put it in my hand as if offering a receipt. "Your role requires stability. Fragility isn't productive." Fragility was the word of the day. Fragility, sensitivity, and inability to meet metrics. He explained that my absence, even temporary, created a gap in coverage that we could not tolerate. He told me about business continuity, as if continuity were a belief and not a regulation. When the service ended, I took my box. It was a cardboard box, like the ones we used to ship raw material samples. My badge and ID card slid to the bottom with a weightless clinked. Gary from security stood by the loading dock, watching the choreography of dismissal with the alertness of one who knew his lines.
They leave you with a box and a palette and a polite, practiced indifference. The first gasps after grief are private. The next ones are procedural. Back in my apartment, I opened the termination envelope with hands that were still shaking. There were the expected formalities: final paycheck, COBRA information, the sterile legalese that explained severance. There was also a paragraph I hadn't anticipated, short and clinical. "As of this notice, your access to company systems and the establishment license tied to you as the named qualified person is deactivated." My name was on the license page. My signature, the one I had signed when I accepted the responsibility of qualified person, sat beneath the printed title. 21 CFR Part 211 articulates the obligations. I speak that language the way other people speak the weather, necessary to keep conversations coherent. The QP signature isn't decoration, it's the legal hinge on which an establishment's authorization rotates. The license lists a named individual because someone who has the final say on batch release must be identifiable and accountable. Remove the name, and the license's robustness frays. The reality hit me like a cold chemical spill. If the establishment license required a currently employed QP, and my employment had been severed without an immediate legitimate appointed replacement, then the plant might, as a matter of regulatory interpretation, be operating without a valid license. That doesn't mean someone outputting product in a building cannot physically ship that product, but it does mean it can be treated as unauthorized by regulators, and that triggers a cascade of consequences that executives like Chad prefer to avoid. I am not a vengeful person by nature. I am a person who believes in rules because they exist to prevent harm. When rules are treated like optional decor, the people who inherit that negligence are patients, consumers, and anyone who trusts that quality has teeth. That morning grief and that afternoon letter colluded to produce another emotion: impossible, cold clarity. I started with what I knew best: records. Documentary evidence is quieter than screaming, and far more dangerous for those who prefer to keep things buried. Signatures, timestamps, admin logs, these are the fingerprints of a production's reality. My phone became a scanner. Marcus, who had been loyal and steady for 10 years, was the first ally I called. He sent a threaded series of photos: a pallet with shrink-wrapped boxes, a truck idling at Dock 4, a manifest screenshot with a $12 million line item blurred only enough to hide internal SKUs. The metadata on the images showed the time, 9:42 p.m., the night after my termination. A time-stamped shot of a handheld scanner with an approval screen front and center showed an override executed at 4:15 p.m. that same afternoon. Marcus sent a transadmin through, he wrote. We got it pushed. Kayla sent a sign-off under management.
Management on a signature line is a euphemism, and euphemisms, when examined under the light of compliance, are often where the rot is clearest. The batch record file Marcus sent had a digital trail. A field that should have been completed by the QP read released with a user ID that did not correspond to any person authorized to sign on behalf of quality. There were comments, terse administrative notes that referenced a business need and prior conversation. The file showed tests that had been logged as pending earlier in the day. The lab instruments outputs appeared in the sequence, but the release flag had been toggled after the override. The electronic signature was an imprint, not a proverb. It could be appended, backdated, or otherwise manipulated by someone with administrator rights if the system's controls were inadequate. I studied the license page again. My name was printed under Named Qualified Person. The license number and the monitored expiration date were there. There was no placeholder for management. There was no emergency option that allowed the CEO to declare a product safe because quarterly metrics demanded it. The problem was not only regulatory, it was financial. The missile thread of modern investment culture is fragile. Startups and public companies alike are funded on trust and projection. When trust is punctured by evidence of regulatory noncompliance, investment evaporates faster than a solvent. Money follows safety. Funding flees risk. I didn't fantasize about embezzlement or goading investors to run. I understood systems. I understood leverage. What I had, after that cardboard box and the funeral, was leverage tied to documentation. I assembled the files on an encrypted drive. I took notes with the precision of someone preparing for a deposition. Who said what, when, and where? The timeline had to be airtight. Text messages from Chad with curt rebuttals, the termination letter and the notice of badge deactivation, Marcus's photos with metadata attached, the batch record with the admin override timestamp, the license page with my name highlighted, and an audio clip, a short, casual voicemail from a plant tech that admitted the line had been pushed out. My lawyer, David Stoller, took calls at odd hours. He is the kind of lawyer who reads regulation the way others read recipes. Each ingredient matters. He listened without dramatic reaction, then mapped the legal landscape out in a calm voice. You need to preserve everything, David said. Screenshots, original files, metadata. Don't delete anything. Don't make copies you later can't justify. But also, do not engage in self-help. You cannot intercept a truck. You cannot render product unusable. That would be reckless, and it would open you up to criminal exposure. I was not looking for a gunfight. I was looking for a procedure. There are channels, David continued. The FDA has a reporting process. OIG complaints can be filed.
Given the QP status, a complaint can be phrased very simply. Plant operating without a valid named QP, potential misbranding or adulteration. The agency will investigate. If they find what you suspect, they can execute a regulatory action that will include inspection, possible injunctions, and notification to investors. Those are serious outcomes, but they're legal. They are the mechanism the system hands people when corporate leadership ignores it. Legal language is made for dispassion. It is crafted to avoid the heat of personal justice and focus on cold enforcement. I liked that about it. There is a dignity to paperwork that matches the dignity I had lost, and I wanted it back. I called Celeste, an investigative reporter I had met years earlier at a safety conference. She had the instincts of someone who believed that stories were the lever that moved institutions. You realize the headline will make me look like I built it, she said, in the way only colleagues who have mutual respect can tease. Then she was serious. Send me what you have. I can't promise a story until I vetted it, but this is the kind of thing that scares investors. If regulators get wind, they'll start asking questions that executives don't like answering in public. We met in a diner late that night. The place smelled like coffee and grease, the windows fishbowled with reflections of passing headlights. I spread printouts across the Formica.
the license page with my name, Marcus's photos, the manifest screenshot, and a screenshot of the admin log showing the 4:15 p.m. override. Celeste flipped through them like a reader paging to the plot point. "This is good," she said. "The timestamps help, and the license ties a name to authority. If you filed a complaint, that would be a primary document for anyone doing due diligence. The trick is timing. If you file before the shipment is away, it might be stopped. If you file after the shipment leaves, the complaint can trigger broader inquiries. Both are meaningful. Timing, as always, was strategic. If I wanted the widest possible impact, regulatory attention plus media amplification that would make investors palpably nervous, I wanted the complaint to be attached to undeniable evidence the company couldn't credibly explain away. I also wanted Marcus's photos to be seen as evidence of a pattern, not just a single error. That night, Marcus texted me again. Loading finished. Truck left at 11:03 p.m., plate 7HB9J4. The manifest had a ship date and a customer line. The customer column was a distribution hub in another state. The shipment represented revenue that investors talking in quarterly calls would treat as tangible validation. I slept poorly, which is to say I slept the way people in production do, in fragments between the demands of adrenaline and the body's insistence on recovery. The next morning I started a checklist. Document, store, notify lawyer, contact the FDA and OIG, contact the reporter. Keep my communications to text and email to preserve them. David advised we proceed carefully. Make the complaint, attach the documentation, and quantify what you can. Times, dates, amounts. Don't editorialize. State facts and let the agency do its job. We'll want the complaint to be precise. We'll ask for an acknowledgement from OIG that they received it. That acknowledgement is itself a document you can use to prove you filed a formal complaint. I spent the afternoon drafting the complaint the way one assembles an operative report. The voice was intentionally flat. The irony was not lost on me that grief had perfected my power of understatement. I narrated the facts, my role, the date of termination, the deactivation of access, and the subsequent override enabling the release of product. I included screenshots with file names, metadata fields visible. I attached the license scan with my name highlighted. I included Marcus's photos as attachments and a manifest screenshot. I noted the shipment's departure time and the truck plate number. It felt like handing a box to an inspector and saying, "Here, open it." Before I hit send, I did one more thing. I called Kayla in HR, because you always give the other side an opportunity to correct its own course. It is an act that makes one morally clean, even when the other side refuses to repair what they've broken. "Kayla," I said, "there has been a release of a batch tonight that had outstanding testing. Who authorized the override?" There was a pause. "We had management approval," she said. "Chad called it." "Is there any documentation of that approval?" I asked. "There's an email thread," she said, the words packing the precise amount of corporate obfuscation. "You won't be able to access it now that you're no longer with the company." "That would be a problem for regulators," I said. "I did not say it would be a problem for your conscience. I do not imagine my words would have pierced a corporate double pane." Kayla's eyes were not on morality, they were on policy. "You can submit a complaint," she said, as if suggesting a menu item. That was the opening I needed. When I hit submit on the OIG online form, an automated response pinged back within minutes. Submission received, case number assigned. The reply was sterile, a formatting of acknowledgement. It did not promise action, but it existed. The act of filing recorded a complaint that could not be silently unmade. The complaint would trigger a review. If the agency saw a possible violation, they could coordinate an inspection or an inquiry. They could escalate. Regulators speak in calibrated moves: inspections, service of subpoenas, and on occasion, unannounced visits that are the legal equivalent of a door being knocked off its hinges. I sent the package to Celeste and copied David. Celeste texted back, immediate. "On it. I'll hold until you say go. Timed release will be cleaner." "Hold?" I wrote. "Yes," she replied.
If we publish while the complaint is in the system, regulators get pressure and investors get nervous. If we publish too soon, regulators have less cover to act. Timing matters. There is a strange morality to this calculus. I was not orchestrating a private vendetta. I was making use of the public levers that are supposed to hold firms accountable. That was my figure of speech for stealing funding. Not theft, but a transfer of confidence from the institution's leaders back to the public processes that protect people. I did not sleep that night either. Instead, I sat in a booth at the diner and watched the news feed on my phone. Guardian updates and industry alerts trickling in like the first signs of a storm. The truck I had photographed in Marcus's images idled past the diner window on its route to a distribution center, a mundane beast of logistics. It looked smaller in the dark. Its plate number flashed in traffic. "You're not going to intercept it," David had said. "You're going to let the system work." The system does not always work. It is messy, bureaucratic, and frequently slow, but it is also the mechanism that translates a single person's evidence into an official inquiry. The space between submission and response is the most volatile. In that quiet, narratives are written by rumor, by analysts calling each other, by investor relations teams drafting statements that sound like everything is under control. That quiet is a vacuum. In it, the truth has a chance to speak, but it needs someone to open the valve. I knew what I had to do next: document everything else. A complaint with attachments is only as good as the chain that supports it. If anything, I wanted to anticipate the company's responses. They would have an answer, a talking point about improved processes, a claim of human error, perhaps an assertion that the QP status was a documentation issue rather than a safety risk. I needed to have the narrative preempted with facts, so I did what I always did, continued to collect. Marcus texted again with another file, a PDF of a shift log where a test failure had been mirrored, but then later marked as corrected without a corresponding lab rerun. The PDF's metadata showed the correction had been logged at 4:18 p.m., 3 minutes after the admin override. The image of Chad at the dock came with casual background details: his jacket, a clipboard, the shadow of a forklift. I called my father in memory and allowed myself some private rage. When someone scoffs at another person's grief as lack of stability, what they are really scoffing at is the messy fact of human responsibility. I could have wasted my anger on theatrics, public scenes, legal threats, a string of social media posts designed to humiliate, but vindictiveness is not my instrument. My instrument is documentation, which is quieter and more permanent. The next morning I got the confirmation. The OIG had received my complaint and assigned a case number. It was an inert string of characters that nonetheless worked like an ignition. I felt the thin, hard satisfaction of pulling a legal pin. The complaint was now in the system. From here, a regulator might open an inspection, an inquiry could be initiated, or a referral could be made. Any of those outcomes would bring professionals into the plant who could parse the logs we could not change, and who had the power to pull licenses or refer matters to criminal investigators if they found willful misconduct. But there was another element I had to manage: optics. If a news story hit while a regulator was still trying to decide whether to act, the court of public opinion could force investors to do what regulators might take weeks to accomplish. Investors hate uncertainty. A bad headline combined with a regulatory referral can be enough to make funding lines freeze or to trigger covenant clauses and financing agreements. The market is just another enforcement mechanism in our modern ecosystem, not legal, but powerful in its own way. I met Celeste again in the early morning because she wanted to set the publication window. "If we drop this within 24 hours of the complaint," she said, stirring her coffee, "investors will read the complaint and our piece in tandem. They'll have to answer to the question, why was a plant operating with a deactivated QP? The PR teams will scramble to issue denials, and those denials will be inconsistent under pressure. You want that inconsistency." "I don't want to ruin people's livelihoods," I said. "Lower-level staff are not the enemy." "And they never are," Celeste replied. "But the people who run the company and put profit above compliance, that's different. They have choices." We crafted a plan that was legal, restrained, and precise. The complaint would sit in the OIG system, cataloged and accessible to investigators who would eventually request records. Celeste would hold until we hit a trigger point that maximized accountability while minimizing collateral harm, when the shipment reached the buyer, not when it left the dock. She argued the buyer's safety depended on knowing whether the release was legitimate. There is an ethical calculus in journalism that is not unlike the one in compliance. Tell the truth where the public has a right to know, but do not manufacture harm. Timing became an obsessively measured variable. The truck was on the highway. Marcus gave me additional images. The manifest was electronically timestamped as scanned out at 11:03 p.m. The buyer had acknowledged receipt by noon the next day. That window was narrow and politically sensitive. If regulators moved before the buyer accepted it, the shipment could be detained. If the buyer accepted it and then had to make a recall, the consequences would be deeper and more visible. I wish I could say that I made these choices purely on principle. In truth, there was a personal contour to everything. A man I loved was dead. He deserved not a theatrical revenge, but a restoration of the dignity he had shown me in the small things, sitting by my bed in the hospital with a cup of cold coffee, telling me not to accept sloppy answers.
I imagined him watching, and I wanted the work I did to reflect what he taught: accuracy, steadiness, and the courage to insist on accountability. Then there was Chad. He thought the world was his to move. He had built an empire on the rhetoric of vision, but vision without control is a hazard to the public. My role, my signature, was designed to be the friction on which that arrogance would grind. I had the documents, I had the complaint, I had the journalist knowing how to cut the story so it would find investors' ears. I had a lawyer who would stand ready to leverage the complaint into process. I had an inside ally in Marcus who risked his job by sending me the photographs. None of this was illegal. None of it was theatrical. It was the slow application of pressure to a brittle structure. That afternoon, I sat on a diner stool and reread the complaint. I had used plain language, and I had refrained from moralizing. Plant operating potentially without a valid named qualified person, I wrote. Apparent administrative override of release criteria documented at 4:15 p.m. Local QA testing shows pending results at time of override. Shipment scanned out at 11:03 p.m. Attachments: license page naming Holly Miller as QP, batch record showing override, photographic evidence of loading, manifest screenshot. I pressed send. An automated reply came back. Case number, receipt time, 3:28 p.m. I walked out into the bright mid-afternoon sun and watched a news cycle that had not yet registered the complaint. The truck was a smudge earlier that day, an insignificant object among many. Now, in my mind, it carried the possibility of accountability. That might seem dramatic, that a box of manufactured product could embody such moral agency, but in the world of regulated goods, every pallet is a bundle of promises, that the contents met specifications, that the label is accurate, that someone took final responsibility. I had not stolen their funding. I had not fabricated evidence. I had provided a record, a set of facts laid bare in a system designed to respond to them. But I knew how the mechanics would work once that record reached the right desks. I knew how investors, hungry for predictable returns, would react to a public regulatory inquiry tied to a named QP. I knew how fragile reputations could be when regulators' letters and newsroom headlines collided. Still, for all the tactical satisfaction, I felt a quiet, complicated grief. I had moved from mourning to action. The two states sat together like separate instruments in an orchestra. One played notes that made my chest ache. The other kept rhythm. There was a grim poetry to it, the human cost of negligence laid next to the measured paperwork that could stop it.
Marcus texted, "They're moving the remaining skids to the warehouse. CEO was on the floor this morning, said business as usual." Chad had always loved that phrase, the soothing chartreuse paint of business as usual, because it implied nothing needed to change. Business as usual is the language of people who prefer to keep harm contained beneath a veneer of productivity. That evening, Celeste sent a message, "Ready to publish after you confirm one more timestamp. The buyer acknowledged receipt at 12:08 p.m. If you want us to go live, say the word." I considered the ethics of publication again. If the buyer had already acknowledged receipt, a recall would be messy. If we published before regulatory action, we'd force institutions to scramble. But repairs sometimes require a public shove. The system's mechanisms are not self-starting. They need someone to turn the key. I typed back, "Hold for now. Let the regulator breathe. If they move, we go. If they don't, we go." It was a hedge and a promise. Hours stretched thin. The city outside my diner window glowed with sodium lights. A barista laughed at something on the radio. Inside, my phone chimed with small communications, messages from my brother, a text from a former lab tech checking in, Marcus's steady updates. The complaint sat in the OIG system, inert and charged at once. At 11:11 p.m., a new message came from Celeste. Industry analysts just called. They're whispering about a pending regulatory inquiry. If OIG starts asking questions, investors will take notice. That was the lever. That was the moment in which quiet documentation sometimes translates into the noisy consequences executives dread. I thought about Chad in his jacket, walking the docks, smiling at forklifts. I thought about how he had used my grief as an opportunity to cut me loose for the sake of operational stability. I drank the cold coffee and waited. There was no immediate thunderclap. There were instead the small signals, a case number in my inbox, a journalist ready with an unpublished story, a lawyer waiting for the regulator to pick up the ball,
and there was in the background the hum of the plant's HVAC spoken in another city where people unconnected to our internal fights were living their lives. If the system worked, it would not be theatrical. It would be methodical. A call to the plant to provide records, a request for raw data, an inspector's unexpected visit. If the system failed, everything would go back to business as usual, and the risk would remain. My father's absence would remain an unresolved punctuation mark in a life that had been interrupted by negligence. I had done what I could within the rules. I had documented, I had filed, I had placed facts where facts belong, in official hands. The last step was waiting. The waiting route of patience feels different when you have a case number. It is not idle. It is a tight, watchful readiness. At midnight, I noticed the feed on my phone had begun to stir. A small trade newsletter had picked up a rumor, industry chatter of pending inspection. That rumble is how markets begin to move. Investors read rumor and regulatory filings and then update spreadsheets in response. There are no dramatic detonations in finance. There are only compounds of uncertainty that suffocate liquidity. I did not expect fireworks. I expected procedure. But sometimes procedure, when combined with a truthful story published at the right time, is explosive in its effects. I slept for a single hour, waking to messages that read like barometric pressure. Celeste asking for permission to publish if regulators did not take action within 8 hours. David asking me to prepare a witness statement. Marcus reporting increased chatter on the shop floor as people wondered why we had filed a complaint against our own company. There is a peculiar thing about institutional silence. When internal systems are turned toward damage control, the people who know the truth become quieter. That quietness is itself evidence. I walked back toward the plant address on a kind of reconnaissance I told myself was only to see what the shipping dock looked like in daylight. The sun struck the loading bay at a glint that reminded me of my father's watch face when he told me, before he died, to always sign what you mean. At the dock, the pallet was empty. The shrink wrap had been cut. Forklift tracks made silent arcs in the concrete. Security cameras blinked. There were a few men milling around, cigarette breaks and water jugs. They asked me to leave. A woman in the parking lot, Kayla from HR, watched me with arms folded and a posture that suggested she wanted to say something she had been told not to. "You people never rest," she said at last, the sentence vaguely accusatory. "I never asked for rest," I replied. "I asked for compliance." She looked away. I left with the ritual of litigation beginning to warm. More documentation, more requests, more paper trails. The complaint, the case number, the journalist, Marcus, the manifest, the timestamps, they were all now in motion, like an insect caught in a clear resin. It will not be a spectacle, it will be an excavation. The truth will be found in the alignments of evidence. On the walk back to my car, my phone buzzed. An automated press alert. PharmaCorp's shares fall on regulatory rumors. The headline was tentative, hedged, and consumed by the usual cautionary language that legal teams love. Company says it is reviewing matters. But the headline existed. The market prick of fear had happened. I paused for a second and felt the odd, almost clinical satisfaction of someone who has seen a machine's gears engage. I did not dance or brag. I stayed quiet, because the rest of the work required patience and accuracy. The thing people do not tell you about the first whistle, it is lonely. People will call you brave in private and cold in public. They will admire and distance themselves at once. They will tell you they feared you had no right, then send you a link to the regulation you are citing. But there is another truth. Systems were built to be used. When the people who maintain them fail to use them ethically, someone else must. I had a case number. I had documents. I had a journalist who trusted me enough to hold the story until the timing was right. I had a lawyer who was steady. And I had a name on a license that did not belong in an envelope. The truck that had carried $12 million of goods that night was now part of a much longer conduit. Printouts and emails and case numbers and a rumor. I had not stolen their funding. I had done what a person working in compliance is supposed to do. I used the rules to point out that the rules had been erased. If the system did its work, the consequence would be measured. Inspections, questions answered under oath, perhaps a voluntary recall, perhaps license limitations, perhaps investor withdrawals. If it did not, then the public remained at risk, and my act would be recorded only among those of us who keep lists. I took a breath and took a photograph of the empty dock. The metadata annotated it the same way every other file had been annotated: location, time, device. I uploaded it to the encrypted drive and closed the case folder for the night. I did not sleep then. I sat and waited for the phone to buzz in a new way, not with condolence but with agency. The case number blinked on the email header, inert and active at once. Somewhere, an investigator might be reading what I'd written. Somewhere, a PR team might be drafting a statement. Somewhere, Chad might be walking the floor with a new kind of calculation in his step. This is the point in these stories where the narrative forks. You either get a quiet correction, or you set a chain in motion that escalates. I had chosen escalation, not because I wanted punishment, but because I wanted responsibility. The next morning, an industry wire flashed with a single line. Unannounced FDA inspection reported at local facility. It was a rumor at that point, a whisper in listservs and chat runs. But regulators do not whisper when they arrive. I sat at the diner window and watched traffic swell along the highway. I thought of my father's last words, practical, ordinary, and felt the small benediction of having made the choice I thought he would have made. The satisfaction was not of triumph so much as of accuracy. I had preserved my dignity in paper and pixels. There was, of course, the cost. Friends texted gently, cautious. Marcus's messages shifted in tone, hesitance, then resolve, then a quiet note that he'd cleaned up his social traces at work. David told me to be careful with whom I shared what. Celeste told me to sleep when I could.
And then there was the larger, slower current. Investors will read a rumor, and in the intervals between rumor and enforcement, money moves. That movement is where an empire can be hollowed out. It is not theft in the illegal sense. It is the market responding to risk. If a CEO built an empire on the assumption regulators would look the other way, that empire was always vulnerable to the clarifying light of accountability. I did not celebrate. I prepared for the questions. I organized the file folders with the same meticulousness I had applied to batch records for years, because in this new reality, my notes were my armor. The phone vibrated. An incoming call from an unknown number flagged as local federal office. My breath stilled. Agents do not always show their hand by calling. The line blinked with a recorded message asking me to expect correspondence regarding a complaint I had filed. I felt the adrenaline like the hum of a centrifuge. This was not the end. It was not the victory either. It was the point at which the system had begun to turn. I closed my eyes and let the motor of process run, trusting that the documentation I had prepared, the timestamps, the license, the manifest, would be legible to people whose job it is to make institutions answer for themselves. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, the diner hummed with small talk and coffee grinders. I picked up my phone and typed a message to Marcus. Stay safe, keep copies. They may ask you to preserve records. Stay safe, keep copies. They may ask you to preserve records. I sent that to Marcus. And then, because some habits are stubbornly human, I checked the inbox again. The federal message I'd seen the night before had been a procedural ping. Now there was a human line attached. Agent Miller from a local field office asked to set up a time to speak. The tone was neither hostile nor warm. Federal curiosity has a way of sounding like a piece of machinery coming to life. Before I go any further, if you've ever worked under a manager who thought cadence and bravado were substitute goods for competence, and this is the kind of story that scratches at something raw in you, subscribe to this channel. You won't get lectures here, just the parts of the system most people don't see until they're caught in the gears. Agent Miller called mid-morning. He had read the complaint. He'd read a few of the attachments. He confirmed he'd initiated a preliminary inquiry and that an inspection team was being lined up. He encouraged me to preserve records and to avoid speculation in public. We'll handle evidence collection, he said. If you can be available for an interview, that would help us sketch the timeline. There is a peculiarity to being involved in a federal inquiry. You feel simultaneously small and impossible. Small because your actions are now a single thread in a much larger weave. Impossible because the weave can change the shape of entire institutions. I told Agent Miller I was available and that David and I would coordinate witnesses. He asked me, politely, whether I had given the materials to anyone else. I told him about Celeste. He did not sound surprised. Journalists and regulators frequently arrive at the same dinner table. Sometimes they pass notes under the table, and sometimes they spar over who gets the entree. The inspection team arrived unexpectedly 2 days later. They did not come with lights and brass bands. They came in plain cars and black boots, and the quiet hunger of people who read file names for breakfast. The inspectors asked for records, for raw data, for access to server logs, and to speak to staff. They moved through the plant the way a competent auditor moves, curious, unimpressed, thorough. Their questions were precise. Who authorized overwrites? How does the EBR handle signatures?
Who had admin privileges? What is the chain of custody for samples? Chad Kensington tried to be tranquil. There is a managerial pose reserved for moments when the floor is actually burning. A steady jaw, small, controlling gestures, the kind of bemused deflection that says everything is under control because you say it is. He'd called an emergency meeting of the senior team and then watched the inspectors walk the lines. Every once in a while he would tilt his head, as if listening to a radio only he could hear. Celeste's story ran the day after the inspection began. She ran it clean and factual. A named QP was terminated. A subsequent administrative override appeared in batch records, and the company was under preliminary inquiry. She did not invent motives. She let metadata speak where rhetoric might have tried to soften facts into plausibility. Her piece included the photographs Marcus had taken, the manifest screenshot, and a copy of my submission to OIG. The headline was sharp but not theatrical. Regulatory inquiry at local facility after QP termination, documents show. The effect was swift. Analysts reached for scripts they already knew. Question management, transparency. Ask for board statements. Note pending liabilities. Investment committees asked for reconciliations. Fund managers who choreograph billions into portfolios based on risk models began to flag the company as watchlist. Funding lines that had been warm and obliging cooled into silence. I did not sit and watch money evaporate. That was not something a compliance professional does with a bag of popcorn. I watched the mechanisms engage. An inspector called to request all release logs for the quarter. A subpoena, or the regulatory equivalent, inched into view. A buyer's procurement manager called to ask whether our product had been released in accordance with procedures. Emails circulated that were equal parts legalese and panic. Sterling, the CEO, circulated a letter to shareholders that read like a man trying to buy time with good typography.
He emphasized commitments to quality and promised cooperation with regulators. Business as usual, he wrote in the middle paragraph, with the same calm arrogance Chad had favored. But typography does not substitute for a named QP on a license page. The board convened an emergency meeting, and that is where things tilt from corporate theater to procedural consequence. I did not know the precise dance of boardroom choreography, but I knew the ground rules: fiduciary duty, disclosure obligations, and the terrifyingly real clause that binds venture and private money managers to act when their assets are endangered. If a regulator shows up and asks hard questions, boards have to either produce credible answers or admit they cannot do so. The morning the agent served subpoenas, the board meeting was underway. I was at the diner, alternately eating stale muffins and refreshing my inbox. Celeste called and said simply, "They're there." She was in the building press area and could see a line of leather chairs unfolding into an auditorium of senior executives. Agents in plain clothes entered the room and presented themselves. Agent Miller's presence was quiet but immovable. He carried a notebook like a ledger. It is an odd tableau when those who decide the fate of millions sit opposite those who enforce the rules that allow those millions to be spent. The agents placed a folder on the conference table: subpoenas for records, requests for login histories, a list of staff to interview. There was a silence that was not dramatic in the way a film might make it. It was a blankness created by the sudden factuality of process. I watched Celeste's face on a call, and she mouthed something I couldn't hear. For a terrible, gleeful second, there was a news organization's satisfaction in watching the gears finally meet. Chad's face, when the agents asked him to step outside, remained carefully blank. You could see, in micro-expression, the shift from managerial control to the dawning horror of accountability. He had counted on the opacity of management to seal the seams. He had not counted on metadata and subpoenas. When the U.S. Marshals showed up, the scene acquired an undeniable gravity. A marshal is not a PR problem. They are a logistical and legal instrument. They enter to ensure that those who must be taken for questioning are secured. I won't dramatize handcuffs and applause. That kind of sensational detail distracts from the point. People were being asked to answer for choices made under the rubric of business necessity. Chad was arrested that day. He was led out in handcuffs. The accusation was not an on-screen confession. Rather, it was the accumulation of documentary evidence, statements, and the agent's determination that the conduct merited further criminal inquiry. I can't pretend victory felt like fireworks. The feeling was more of a mechanical release. A pressure valve opened. Sterling's position became too complicated for simple statements.
Investors wanted assurances, and boards are, in the end, answerable to money. The company issued a statement: cooperation with regulators, internal review, zero tolerance for deviations. The board placed Sterling on leave pending the outcome. The phrasing was careful, deliberate, and designed to be legally defensible. But language cannot hide the fact that when the market smells risk and regulators knock on the door, confidence can be withdrawn faster than any CEO can compose a corporate letter. I watched the market move with an unfamiliar kind of intimacy. Share prices fell, funding committees paused, credit lines were reevaluated. Major investors requested immediate transparency. Some simply pulled their lines. It is not theft to say that funding evaporated. It is a market response to increased regulatory risk. The same investors who once praised vision and scale suddenly acted like risk managers. They either did what their fiduciary duty required, or they saw an opportunity to excise a failing asset from their portfolios. Within days, the plant was served with a notice. Operations suspended pending a full inspection and a determination on the validity of the establishment license, given the issue of a named QP. The license status page that had once been a dozen neat lines in a digital file was flagged as under review. Contractual obligations with buyers were renegotiated or voided. Plant operations that had been humming were suddenly in slow, bureaucratic freeze. Sometimes I still find it hard to explain the emotional geometry of that period. There's a thin satisfaction in watching rules you respect do their work. There's also the echo of grief. The personal cost had not been neutralized by corporate consequences. You can lose a father and still press for the right technical chain of custody. The two things do not cancel each other out. They coexist like two instruments in a score. One plays a low, aching note, the other keeps the beat of duty. Celeste's follow-up coverage was careful. She focused on the documents and the sequence. She highlighted the role of a named QP and explained in plain language why a deactivated QP matters. Readers heard the story not as a vendetta, but as a matter of public interest. When product labeled safe might not have been released by someone who had authority to make that claim, people needed to know. That story widened the circle of scrutiny from regulators to customers and to financial backers. David handled the legal motions with a surgeon's hand. He kept me focused on what would be asked and how to answer without coloring the facts. Be factual, he said. The narrative will be constructed by the evidence. That advice is both humble and ferocious. It strips emotion into a set of provable statements. There was a point where the legal and the financial started working in parallel. The regulatory materials requested were producing unambiguous gaps.
Access logs showed admin accounts used in ways inconsistent with policy. Interviews corroborated that the override had been requested as a management expedient. The more the documents lined up, the less plausible the narrative of human error became. At one hearing, an inspector directly asked whether a named QP could be considered replaced by management. The inspector's voice was flat. "We have to ensure the individual with final responsibility on batch release is identifiable and authorized," she said. Absent that, the release may be considered unauthorized. The legalese is dull, but its teeth are sharp. The board, sensing the erosive effect of both regulator scrutiny and investor retreat, moved decisively. Sterling stepped down as CEO. Step down is a kind phrase. He was asked to leave, and the board appointed an interim executive. Press releases used phrases like transition and refocusing priorities. But in less subtle channels, the calls between portfolio managers, the lines of credit conversations, the company was described as compromised. That was the collapse the title promises, rendered honestly. Not a cinematic theft, but a market evacuation. Funding lines that had been willing to underwrite growth paused. Partner contracts were renegotiated. The empire Sterling had cultivated, a network of investments, brand deals, and business units, did not simply vanish overnight, but its momentum was arrested. Without trust from investors and without an uncontested license to operate, growth-oriented structures become liabilities. The plant was sealed. Agents took records. U.S. Marshals stood by as containers were logged. There are images that linger. The quiet of a sealed clean room. The way light sits on stainless steel when processes stop. The hum that dies when power is reduced to essential levels. There was no cinematic explosion. Instead, there were forms, inventory lists, chains of custody, and the deliberate work of ensuring evidence integrity. Marcus lost his job. He had sent me photos, and he paid a price for his loyalty. Some of the technicians were furloughed as operations paused. I remind myself of that often, because the system's correction mechanism can collateralize the innocent as it pares away the culpable. I did what I could to get Marcus counsel and to press for him to be engaged as a cooperating witness. His testimony was material to the timeline. There are ways the system protects those who speak the truth. Doing so rarely spares them personal cost. Chad faced charges. The specific counts alleged will be the province of prosecutors and courts. I am careful in how I say that, because accusing people publicly of crimes before a jury or judgment is dangerous and unfair. What is true is that his actions were the locus for regulatory and criminal scrutiny, administrative overrides for release, misrepresentation to regulators, and potentially other counts that arise when documents conflict with actions. Sterling's empire,
the assemblage of brands and capital he had curated, contracted in the months that followed. Funding tables were adjusted, boardrooms updated their risk models, private lenders invoked covenants. I would not say his entire life's work collapsed in an afternoon. Careers built on fragile confidence rarely do. But enough funding dried up that his strategy could not be sustained, and he and his inner circle lost the practical ability to execute the growth plans they'd promised. After all of that, the personal landscape shifted in quieter ways. I received an email, one morning in late spring, from Eleanor, VP of Quality at a competing firm that had watched our plant from a distance, doing its own assessments of risk and talent. Her note was direct and unvarnished. She had read Celeste's coverage. She had seen the documentation. She wanted to talk about whether I would consider moving into a role where authority and compliance mattered, not just as a title, but as a core of the business. It was an odd recruitment. There had been calls before. Competitors sometimes reach out when there is churn. But Eleanor's message was different. She wrote, "We need someone who will not let gravity of compliance slack. If you're willing, we can offer a role that gives you the authority you had and the support for it." I interviewed with her and then with the board of her company. Their questions were practical and direct. They wanted to know how I thought about rebuilding trust, how to structure QP roles to avoid single points of failure, and how to ensure admin privileges and release mechanisms were firewalled from management pressure. They asked about staff morale and how to integrate technicians who might feel bruised by public scrutiny. Those were good questions. I answered them in the same voice I had used in depositions, factual, sober, and precise. They offered me a position, Senior Director of Quality, with a clear charter. It meant relocating, a modest raise, and a team that trusted documentation. It was not revenge, nor was it some kind of coronation. It was work that mattered, and in that way it felt like an appropriate coda. I accepted. The months after the inspection were a blur of interviews, depositions, and testimony. I met with investigators, I answered questions at length about the timeline, I handed over files. The interrogations were meticulous. David coached me on phrasing. Avoid speculation, stick to observable facts, give context where needed. He reminded me that the truth is most resilient when it is clean and provable. Celeste's continued coverage evolved into a longer feature that explored the systemic weakness, how a single administrative override can ripple into regulatory failure. She framed it not as my story alone, but as a pattern across an industry that sometimes treats compliance like an inconvenient box to tick, rather than a guardian of public trust.
Her narrative was generous to the lower-level staff and pointed at the executives who had made decisions, sometimes for profit, sometimes for optics, that bypassed safeguards. There were trade-offs. Some people called me a troublemaker, others called me brave. The former insult stung less than the latter comforted. Truth-telling is not neat. It invites both admiration and retribution. I lost friends. I gained work I felt was meaningful. I also learned how fragile institutions can be when their leadership prizes image over accountability. In the quiet moments, which remained rare, I would think of my father. He had died weeks before the first inspection. He had never worked in a clean room or in manufacturing. He was a postal worker most of his life, a man who took pride in being reliable and accurate. One day, when I was a teenager, he had told me, "A signature means you put your name on the line. Don't put your name behind things you can't stand by." I kept that in the back of my head when I signed release documents. I kept it when, post-termination, I saw my name on a license page and knew it could mean something more. There were legal settlements later, confidential and administrative in nature. The company paid fines and agreed to remediation. Some senior executives were replaced, some investors took losses, others restructured. Chad entered plea negotiations, or so the report suggested. Charges were filed and later resolved in court processes. I do not gild these actions with triumphalism, because the useful work, preventing harm, is not served by those excesses. The important thing was not that people were punished so much as that the mechanics of accountability acted. I returned, in a formal capacity, to the world I had walked away from. The new job was not a revenge-architected prize. It was an opportunity to rebuild a culture where a QP's authority is respected, where admin accounts have audit trails, where overrides require robust, documented justification and cannot be a rhetorical tool for expediency. In policy terms, that meant revising SOPs, implementing technical controls, and instituting independent audits. In human terms, it meant training and listening, and occasionally being a custodian of patience.
The irony, or the lesson, is that the instruments designed to protect us can also be the instruments that enforce repair when they are used. Paperwork, signatures, timestamps. These are not glamorous. They are, however, effective. The bureaucracy I had once resented for being slow became the procedure that prevented immediacy from becoming irreversible harm. People ask whether I regret the escalation. They want to know if losing friends or precipitating layoffs sits easy with me. The answer is complicated. I regret the harm that falls on the innocent. I do not regret surfacing a truth that allowed systems to act.
For me, the point was never punitive catharsis. It was the restoration of a condition in which release decisions are made by people who can be held accountable and systems that preserve traceability. There is a sense, too, in which silence is expensive. When employees choose to look away to preserve their paychecks and their quiet, the cost of that silence is borne by consumers and by trust itself. When somebody decides to document instead of silence, the result can be messy, but it can also be corrective. I have no illusions about being heroic. I filed a complaint and let the instruments of regulation and the market do what they do. They did not always act swiftly or perfectly, but they acted. Months later, I was asked to give a talk at an industry conference on the role of the QP in modern manufacturing. It was odd to be on a stage again, not as a wet lab technician, but as someone who had watched an institution change shape. I spoke about the physicality of signatures, about digital logs, about the human costs. I told the room that a license is not a piece of paper to be moved like scenery. It is a social contract, a promise to the public. At the end of my remarks, I said something I did not expect to say out loud. You can build a company that grows as tall as you like, but if your foundation is confidence instead of competence, your tower will be hollow. The market will not protect you. The public will not forgive you. A signature is not a phase of employment. It is a responsibility. And sometimes the cost of keeping silence is calculated in lives, not margins. After the talk, people came up to me with their stories. Technicians with narrow escapes, quality managers who had been sidelined, executives who admitted they had learned to listen the hard way. They did not want moralizing. They wanted practical guidance about creating systems that made shortcuts harder and accountability easier. That, too, felt like a measure of repair. I did not become someone who enjoys the collapse of a company. I became someone who appreciates the stabilizing effect of rules. If that makes me unromantic, so be it. The romance belongs to people who believe in rescue without cost. My work is to ensure procedures protect. There was a final paperwork piece to close. When the establishment's license status was finally adjudicated, it was suspended pending correction, and later reinstated under a new QP with oversight and audit commitments. The plant reopened under strict conditions and a different leadership team. The change did not make the past disappear. It simply made it less likely that similar choices would be repeated at that facility. People asked if I took down Sterling's empire. The shorthand satisfies a headline. The truth is less theatrical, and I think more durable. I documented a sequence of events that made the company answerable to its own rules and to the public that depends on those rules. Investors recalibrated. Leadership was reshaped. People were held to account in the forms the law allows. That is not theft. It is exposure, transparency, and a market responding to risk. When the dust settled, I signed new forms, took responsibility for new batches, and trained teams on how to document everything worth documenting. I learned, again, that people's dignity lies partly in the care others take over how their work is represented. My father had taught me that a signature should mean something. I had placed mine where it mattered, and when someone treated that signature as a bureaucratic placeholder, I used the channels the system offers to make the placeholder significant. There is no perfect ending to stories like this. People got hurt, people were corrected, institutions adjusted. My career continued, quieter now, more focused, and the public conversation about accountability in manufacturing had moved a few degrees toward clarity. One evening, not long after I'd settled into the new role, I walked by a printing press run for labels. The operator smiled at me, and we nodded like people who have both habit and hope. I thought of my father, and the small things he did that were not noticed but were essential: folding a letter, taking a list, showing up when a neighbor needed help. I thought of signatures, of humble, ordinary fidelity. If the title of this piece claims I stole their funding, then let the record show I did not. I exposed what was happening. Investors, rightly, reassessed their risk. Funding fled the unsafe ground. The result was a practical denouement: leadership change, regulatory consequences, and the reallocation of capital away from a structure that had treated compliance as optional. That outcome felt like justice, not theft. As for what I carry forward, an abiding care for the processes that protect others, an insistence that documents mean what they say, and a particular appreciation for how the mundane work of recording, timestamps, metadata, signatures, can be the most consequential work of all. If nothing else, my story is a practical note. Signatures are not ceremonial. They are responsibility. Silence is expensive, and when someone treats governance like a suggestion, the systems that protect people can be used, precisely and legally, to enforce the promise that quality once stood for. If this resonated with you, subscribe to hear more stories about how rules matter when lives depend on them. Thank you for listening.